Germany, April 1945. The war was officially ending, but the stench of evil was still fresh. While the rest of the world looked toward the peace tables in Berlin, General George S. Patton, Jr. was leading a victory column through the heart of Thuringia, deep in the German heartland. He wasn't tucked away in a safe rear echelon headquarters. He was exposed, defiant, riding in an open armored car, his iconic ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the pale spring sun. But inside a captured manor near Weimar, the general's march came to a sudden, sickening halt. Patton entered an oak-paneled study that smelled of expensive cedar and cold indifference. On a desk of polished mahogany sat a piece of craftsmanship that made the general's stomach turn. It was the top of a human skull, meticulously sawed at the crown and encased in a rim of high-grade German silver. To a casual observer, it was a macabre curiosity, a functional ashtray. But when Patton opened the top drawer of that same desk, the horror became surgical. Resting there, neatly filed next to a bottle of ink, was a battered American dog tag and a photograph of a smiling young captain from the 4th Armored Division. The Nazi who lived here hadn't just killed an American officer. He had turned a human being into a desk accessory. He had used the remains of a brave man to catch the glowing embers of his cigars while he wrote reports to his superiors. This wasn't just a discovery of a war crime. It was an intimate insult to the uniform Patton worshipped. The general didn't shout. He didn't swear. He felt a cold, murderous clarity. He took off his leather gloves, touched the dog tag with a trembling hand, and whispered a sentence that terrified his own staff. "This man thinks he is a collector of trophies. I am going to make him intimately familiar with the ones he threw away." The search for the owner of the villa wasn't a military operation. It was a manhunt fueled by pure, focused rage. Patton's intelligence teams, the G2, didn't look for a soldier. They looked for a psychopath with a taste for luxury. 36 hours later, elements of the 80th Infantry Division intercepted a civilian ambulance near the Bavarian border. Inside was SS Standartenführer Karl von Kleist. He had traded his black uniform for the rags of a peasant, but he couldn't hide the cold arrogance in his eyes or the manicured hands that had never seen a day of manual labor. When they brought him back to the villa, Kleist didn't act like a prisoner. He acted like a diplomat. He demanded a formal trial, cited the Geneva Convention, and complained about the quality of the rations he had been given. He saw the silver-lined skull on his desk and didn't even flinch. To him, it was a scientific memento, a trophy of a superior race. He spoke of the new order and how the weak were merely raw material for the strong. This was the psychological gap Patton had to cross. He realized that a standard military prison would be a gift for a man like Kleist. A cell would provide safety, food, and a chance to maintain his aristocratic ego. Patton knew that to break a monster, you have to strip away the gentleman's mask and drag him into the rot he created. The general looked at the skull, then at the Nazis' clean hands. This wasn't just war. It was a collision of two universes. Patton leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "You talk of laws and conventions, Kleist, but you forget one thing. Today you aren't in a court of law. You are in my house, and in my house we pay our debts in blood and bone." Patton didn't use a whip. He used a mirror of morality. Instead of sending Kleist to a prisoner of war camp, he marched him to a muddy, unmarked pit behind the manor. This was where the SS had dumped the bodies of local resistance fighters and Allied soldiers who had been processed in the villa. The ground was hard, frozen by a late spring frost, and the smell of decay was beginning to rise with the morning thaw. Patton handed Kleist a small, rusted trench tool, a piece of metal no larger than a dinner plate. "You enjoyed the skull on your desk, Steiner," Patton growled, his revolvers glinting. "Now you will find the rest of him, and you won't use a machine. You will use your hands." For 12 agonizing hours, the elite SS officer was forced to excavate the pit. His soft, manicured hands were soon raw and bleeding, caked in the frozen filth of the earth. Patton sat in a chair at the edge of the pit, watching every movement like a hawk. He held the silver-rimmed skull in his lap, draped in a clean white cloth, a silent, heavy reminder of the crime. This wasn't just physical labor. It was a systematic dismantling of an ideology. Every time Kleist tried to stop, or every time he looked up with a plea for mercy, Patton would point to the white cloth. "The man in this cloth didn't get to rest. Neither do you. Dig until the earth yields what you stole." The psychological breaking point came when Kleist was forced to retrieve the remains of the very soldiers he had mocked. Patton made him carry each bone with his bare hands and place them onto a white silk sheet spread across the grass. The Superman was now a servant to the dead, forced to face the physical reality of his own depravity. By midnight, Kleist was a sobbing, broken wreck, his arrogance buried under the mud of the garden. He was no longer a Standartenführer. He was a shivering animal, begging for a mercy he had never shown others. Patton didn't just break his back. He shattered the myth of Nazi superiority, proving that even the most feared commanders of the Reich were cowards when forced to touch the results of their handiwork. Patton wasn't finished. He knew that for a man like Kleist, the ultimate insult wasn't the mud or the manual labor. It was the people he considered subhuman. As dawn broke over the ruins of Thuringia, the general called for a detachment from the 761st Tank Battalion, the legendary Black Panthers. These were the men Steiner's ideology told him were inferior, the men he believed were unfit to even stand in his presence. Patton looked at the mud-covered, weeping Nazi and gave a final cold order. "Take this creature to the gates of the nearest liberated camp. Don't let him speak. Don't let him use his rank. Just hand him over to the survivors and tell them this is the man who turned their brothers into desk ornaments." This was Patton's surgical justice. He didn't execute Kleist with a bullet. He executed his identity. He handed him over to the very people Kleist had spent years trying to erase from the earth. As the truck pulled away, Kleist's screams echoed through the forest, but there was no one left to listen. He was never seen again. Official records would later list him as disappeared during transport, a common phrase in the chaotic weeks of the collapse. But the veterans of the 4th Armored Division knew the truth. They knew that Patton had delivered a sentence that no judge could ever write. He had turned the predator into the prey and stripped him of his rank, his dignity, and finally, his name. This wasn't just revenge. It was a mechanical necessity to win the peace. Patton understood that against an ideology of absolute evil, bureaucracy is a failure. You have to break the spirit of the enemy to ensure they never rise again. By handing Kleist over to the survivors, Patton ensured that the last thing the Nazi felt wasn't the power of the Reich, but the absolute power of those he had failed to destroy. The silver-rimmed skull was never displayed in a museum trophy case. Patton kept it in a plain wooden box until the war's final days, when he personally ensured the remains were returned to a small family cemetery in the American Midwest. He never spoke of the villa, the shovel, or the white cloth in his official memoirs. He knew that some truths are too heavy for the history books, but this secret incident reveals the true nature of Patton's leadership. He didn't just fight for territory. He fought for the sanctity of the soldier. He understood that a soldier's uniform isn't just fabric. it's a promise of protection. By forcing a monster to touch the reality of his crimes, Patton kept that promise. The skull remains a ghost of a darkness so deep, it required a man of iron will to stare it down and refuse to blink. Patton proved that even in the chaos of a world at war, justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in the cold, silent gaze of a general who refused to let a hero's sacrifice be turned into an ornament. The war ended in May 1945, but for George S. Patton, the victory was won in that muddy garden behind a villa, where a monster finally learned what it felt like to be human.